Okay, let's see if this. Ah. Okay. Hello? Maybe? I don't know. Let's see if this works. Okay, yeah, it works. Okay. Just making sure that the audio is going on. Gonna. Let's not minimize that. So, today's video is going to be about people. It's one of my favorite subjects. Let me fix my microphone a little bit. So, with this conversation about people that I inevitably want to bring up is there are a few ways to talk about people. I know that there's a lot of people don't like seeing the lives of others degraded to such a thing as being just a statistic, just a means of a workforce, or there's more value to human life than looking at them as ants. But I bring this up this way because I remember one time being in a high-rise building for an interview of some sort. And when I was in that interview, I always remembered I was in like this office, and the person who was giving me the interview was he was like a supervisor of some sorts, but he got to oversee a lot of people. And when I was in his building, it reminded me of a documentary that I had watched a long time ago about the sort of individuals that kind of get encapsulated in these positions of power in corporate America. And when I looked down, everybody looked like ants. And, I have this whole philosophy about leisurely time, and you're only really allowed the freedom of thought, or you're allowed the freedom of thought and the freedom of thinking if you have leisurely time. And the people who are offered that, the people who are offered that expense are very far and few in between. And I always appreciated the fact that in my lifetime, I always had that freedom of leisurely thought, where I never really was put in a strenuous situation where I wasn't allowed to think. I wasn't allowed the freedom of having these really grand ideas. And growing up, I really appreciated that. So like this free form of thought process has always allowed me to look at topics and look at life through a different lens. So, talking about people, it's one of my favorite subjects because I've put a lot of thought into thinking about people. Because I was an outcast growing up. I was never really allowed to be a part of the in group, and it's kind of a reoccurring theme in my life. So, talking about people, the title of this video is actually pretty telling of what it's going to be. We have nature versus nurture. Now, these two things branch off at the seams because nurture is basically your environment. Forgot this. Environment. While nature is basically your genetics. Essentially what you are given by your mom and your dad. And these two things are a very complex math equation. It isn't necessarily set in stone. Obviously, there is leeway and there is a form of you escaping certain limiting factors from your genetics and from your environment, but a lot of that is effort. Effort, or what do you want to call it? Work? There's effort of escaping both your genetic defaults and your environment defaults. But that comes with a lot of effort, a lot of work. But what people forget is that there are external forces that affect both sides of this equation. And there's been a long history of individuals who have put a lot of time and effort into understanding humanity. Now, before I continue here, I wanted to play a 3-minute clip from one of my most favorite thinkers that I've found. His name is Patrick Ryan, and there's no real way of summing this up besides this. The 20th century can be summarized as the holy wars to control the evolution of evolution. I've also found a lot of literature from kind of the turn of the century, from like 1870 to 1920, of people who have put a lot of effort in research, and there was a lot of effort into trying to understand what made humanity tick and how that could be steered. And I always kind of thought it was hilarious that a lot of the people that put a lot of time and effort into this, instead of them being called eugenicists in modern day times, they're called zoologists. But essentially, they're still the same thing. So I'm going to mute myself really quickly.
All of this is the backdrop for the 20th century. And I believe the 20th century can be summed up as the holy wars to control the evolution of evolution. And I say holy wars, and I mean the programming term, where you have people who have opinions about a certain open source project, and they're like, oh, well, I'm going to fork the project to do this. And the other guy says, well, I'm going to fork the project to do this. And you have a holy war, and there's no reason the forking exists anyway, but people just fucking do it. And that's pretty prominent in Linux. But that's what I mean by holy wars. So to control the evolution of evolution, right? So it's kind of recursive, but it's important because evolution itself is this process that's organically going on. So you want to control and iterate this process, which is the evolution of evolution. So just to recap, everything I've been talking about has been treating the evolution of evolution as policy. So we start with Plato, control the breeding of the elites. Middle Ages, where that's the elites say, fine, sounds like a good plan to me, and they do it forever. You have Malthus, who says, but we also got to control the breeding of the poor. Darwin says, hey, we can make new species through breeding. That's cool. And then you have Galton, who says, we're going to systematically control the breeding in the name of public health. So this is the intellectual foundation behind mass applied eugenics, right? And so this is where the holy wars start.
Now, I just want to add that people would assume that because this is an old format of thinking and what do you want to call it? Some people would say that this is outdated science, but it's important that he calls this policy. We would like to think that our thought process, or at least our standardization of living, has moved past that, but it really hasn't, because you have a lot of people who still get to control what academic policy is, or the way that intellectual papers are written. And a lot of this science is still somewhat applied in those research studies one way or another, because a lot of it has to do with the nature of how scholarly journals are kind of validated with one another, and how it's essentially a Jenga tower that's just been built on top of prior scientific research that, once it was proven faulty, never really got taken out of the foundation, because if it did, it would tumble the whole thing. And in science and in a lot of academics, that isn't necessarily applied, because it would demean and it would invalidate so much research that, you're right, the tower would come falling down. But whole other topic.
Because once people, they all agree here to like, okay, that's an intellectual line that I agree with. But now that we're here, who controls the breeding? Who's it going to be? Which philosopher king is it going to be? Well, Margaret Sanger thought that all women should control the breeding programs. Adolphin Hortler, whose name I can't say, thought the state should control all the breeding programs. Henry Ford thought the oligarchs should control it. This guy you've never heard of either, Lysenko. Lysenko is the reason why Russia's genetics program are in a complete disarray. They still haven't recovered from his idiocy. He thought the people should control all breeding programs. Then you have hippies just running around saying, fuck this, hit the brakes, get nature have a shot at this. It did good enough, it should, keep going. Then you have Craig Ventnor, who is, you never want to be against this guy in a fight. This guy will wreck your life. He says the market should be in control of the breeding programs. Then you have Josiah, last name always escaped me, Zahner, I think it is. He says the individual should at least have a stake in all of these breeding programs if they're all over the place. And then, of course, everybody's favorite deep state black ops spook, who certainly didn't kill himself. He thought that him and his clan should control the breeding programs, and he funded the hell out of that stuff. And one day, all that's going to come to the forefront. But he was big on this stuff too. He was super big on this stuff. So this is how the Holy Wars basically evolved to control the evolution of evolution. And all of these guys were wrong. They're all wrong, every single one of them.
Now, I would really suggest finding this video. You could just type in the Dark Stoa, and you would get a playlist of all of his work. These are basically presentations where he brings up very big ideas, very, very big ideas. But what I kind of want to stick to is just looking at the line. Because essentially, because we're talking about people, I want to bring up the biggest notion of all, is the fact that there has been a lot of thought processes, or there's been a lot of, not research, not thoughts, but there's been an effort into understanding people as a whole. We could look at the fact that the personality test is one of the most popular things ever, right? Where you can take this really long test and it'll essentially kind of give you whatever those INTJ, whatever the fuck those letters are, and it'll essentially assign you some sort of profile that could give insight into who you are as a person, and that's a psychological study. Here, this is more of the genetical side of things, but it is important to realize that from the 70s and on, there was still an effort into kind of steering where all of this went. I don't remember which one of my previous videos I kind of bring this up, but America has had a very long history in attempting and continuing the research of both sides of this coin, the nature side of things with genetics and the nurture side with environment. So this video was actually going to start off with me making a review of an anime, but I realized that there are a lot of people who watch my videos who don't necessarily watch anime, so I really couldn't go with that angle at the beginning because the anime is somewhat cringy, but it kind of does tackle both sides of this coin of genetics and environment, and the anime primarily tackles more of the environment stuff. So the anime is called Psychopaths, and it essentially, I guess the headline of it would be, it's a dystopian world where your psychological evaluation comes from being evaluated by this smart system. And the smart system basically gives you a numerical value to what your psychological profile is. And if that number is too high, you become a risk of tainting the rest of the people around you. So you are kind of dealt with, and you're removed from the genetic pool so that your ideas or your tainted personality or whatever psychological skews you have don't further elaborate into society, that you're dealt with immediately. And the story is told through a detective who starts her first day as a part of the police force and task force of this. Towards the end of the series, there's a really big plot twist. So I will be I've been rewatching the show in order to make a review for that. But either way, back to this. So this is still kind of in control now, where in a weird way, if we look at the way the state of women are in the Western world, they do have a lot of say and control over breeding as a whole. Not to say any of that incel popular stuff, but in a weird way, if you look at the state of the dating market and how, like, more recent statistics show that the majority of women are chasing after the same 12% of men, that is somewhat translating into women controlling breeding as a whole. But that's more recent thanks to the advent of like dating apps. The state controlling breeding programs, well, that does somewhat exist if we look at the statistics of. Man, I wanted to sneeze. Well, the state controlling breeding programs somewhat does exist because that's more of the environment side, because you do have some states that basically incentivize women not to stay with their baby dads or the fathers of their children. In order to incentivize them, they essentially give the state gives them more money. The oligarchs controlling all breeding programs, well, that translated into Epstein and a lot of the funding he was doing during the 80s. That's a whole other bag of worms. Now, Lachenko, people controlling breeding programs. Nowadays, does anybody actually take into consideration what they're doing with themselves? Because I still remember this one guy. His name was Jeremy. I was introduced to him through a mutual friend, and he was a big car guy, right? This guy was 19 years old. He was 19 years old, and he already had his third kid. So it would just baffle me to see all of these young people just putting themselves through being like young parents and not really putting thought or consideration into what the future of what that child's future would look like. And nowadays, a lot of people don't even take into consideration having kids or starting a family or what any of that would mean. Let's not go there. Now, here we have the hippie age, which we would call the 70s, where nature must control the breeding programs. Well, that's kind of impossible. If you look at the state of what we call free will and the lack thereof it, I don't know what people believe nowadays, but there is no free will. Considering the algorithms, considering how markets essentially control thought processes through either storytelling, soap operas, essentially what you see on the television. I always still remember when what was that TV show? It was essentially a TV show where you would see like 16-year-olds essentially become parents. I remember I was in that demographic when that TV show came out, where we saw a rise of high schoolers trying to trap their boyfriends, essentially getting pregnant by them so that they could stay. And a lot of it was just fueled by what they were seeing on these new reality shows that were coming out. And this was, like, I want to say around the time like Jersey Shore had season 1. So let's not. It's a whole other time period. We have the markets must control breeding programs. Well, why would markets want a say in where there's more population? Where a good example of this would be looking at the migrant workers. Now, people would like to point the finger and make it a political issue, but I never made it a political issue because I always made it a slavery issue. You essentially have all of these open job markets where they require workers, they require people, but the only way for them to get the kind of people that they want, which is cheap labor, people who don't have Social Security, people who don't have those protections in the state of where they're working at. So essentially, you kind of incentivized immigrants to come over to the United States to work at a cheaper rate, all because these businesses and these corporations don't want to pay the worth of a worker who is born in this country. And that's kind of where Cesar Chavez kind of made a name for himself, because he basically saw on the front line of things that you had corporations who did not want to pay workers what they were worth, right? Because you're guaranteed certain workers' rights when you have a Social Security number. He essentially saw these corporations bring over migrant workers that they could pay a much less, like, they could pay pennies to these people and they would be okay with it. but a lot of it had to do with the fact that they were not protected in any way. So it's essentially a form of slave labor, but that's a whole other point. The individual must have a stake in all breeding programs, da 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 da. That can go on. There is a bit more.
Around 1950. That changed with Mendel. That starts with the change.
Either way, there's more to this, but this is a great video. In this video, for those who don't know, CRISPR is essentially a corporation that was attempting to kind of, you know what I mean, like designer babies, where you could essentially have a say in what the genetic makeup of people would be. Well, that's what CRISPR was. Their whole goal was to essentially get to control what the genetics of people would be in a very designer way. Either way, moving on. People. We got nature and nurture. Nature deals with genetics. I'm going to go more with the nurture side of things, with environment, because this is much more interesting to me. Because when you have your environment, you have the things that essentially create your identity. So let's start off with identity. Your identity is composed of what is around you, right? I'm brown. In my neighborhood, there's a lot of Mexicans, Latinos. That goes into creating my identity. But we also have other things. We have music. We have movies. We have TV shows. Now, people would like to say that you have a lot more freedom of thought into this, but it's kind of funny because I have a cousin of mine who, I can't remember how this story came up, but he was telling us about how when he was in high school, it was the first time that he ever watched one of those Latino gang movies, and he was having trouble at school with these bullies, or not, I don't want to say bullies, but it was essentially a gang that was kind of attempting to push control over him and his friends. But he said the moment that he watched that movie, it motivated him into taking on that mentality and defending what he thought was, I don't know how to say it, but it just describes a moment where, because of his cultural identity, because of his genetic identity, and because of what the movie was portraying was very similar to what he was seeing in his own life, he essentially decided to make decisions that would fall in accordance to what he just learned from the movie. So, monkey see, monkey do sort of thing, but that's beyond the point. School. I'm just going to put school. School / friends. I don't know if this is very visible or not. What else dictates your environment? Oh, the neighborhood. Excuse me if I don't know how to spell neighborhood. Your neighborhood. Obviously, I could keep going from this, but when you, right, I'm going to put the word industry right here. Industry. There's an industry that gets to decide these things: music, movies, television shows, to some degree schools, and to some degree even neighborhoods. But the idea of suburbs, I would say, that became more prevalent during the 90s, but that's for other reasons. Now, in the industry, you essentially have the status quo. The status quo, or what I would like to call, not influencers, what would you call them? The people that get to decide who gets signed and who doesn't get signed, who gets to be a pop star and who doesn't get to be a pop star. Obviously, that goes into marketing trends or trends in general, but there's a person at the end of the day who gets to decide who signs that piece of contract. So I'm just going to call them contractee. No, contractor. Con contractor. Excuse me, burping a lot through the soda. Now the contractor. Damn, I can't remember. But there was a famous interview recently that I saw, or at least it was making the rounds on TikTok, but I had previously seen it before, where it was just somebody basically saying that during the advent of gangster rap during the 90s, he was essentially one of the people that were invited to a meeting that had the heads of a variety of different industries, like the prison industry, the clothing industry, the music industry, movie industry. And essentially their whole aim and their whole goal was to creating this self-feeding mechanism of essentially through music, movies, and TV shows, kind of creating this loop system. I'm just going to call it feedback prison loop, where through these three things, music, movies, and TV shows, right, we're already, right, America's very guilty of this. And the way that you create this is called typecasting. Typecasting. For those who don't know what typecasting is, the human brain's a very interesting thing, but it's always a pattern recognizing. Like, you're always trying to recognize patterns. You're always trying to find the pattern in things and trying to make sense of the world through these pattern recognition, like, I don't know, self-feeding, like, algorithms that we have. Pattern recognizing. Like, it sucks to say this, but we've been figured out, like, humanity's been figured out through a science. This isn't through me. This isn't through some, like, grand conspiracy of things. There's enough information about this in marketing firms, in psychological research studies, that if you're, I don't want to say criminally inclined, but if you're the type of individual who can be creative enough into reading all these reading this research material, kind of like Keith Rene. Keith Rene was the guy who created Nixium. All right, now this is a very interesting guy. I'm gonna put his name right here. Keith. Can't remember how to spell Rene, but he essentially created this organization called Nixium. Now, he hired this lady who was the top leading scientist in linguistic neural programming. NLP, linguistic neural programming. I think that's what it's called. I don't know. This court case was already done with. He's in jail. The lady that worked with him is in jail too. But essentially, it was through the use of speech, through the use of language, words, and by speech, I mean the way you enunciate words, the way that you deliver certain things. You can essentially kind of dictate, and you can kind of program people into creating a persona. Not them creating a persona in you, but you creating a persona of the person doing the programming. And when you already develop this sort of when you already develop how do I say this? When you already have a preconceived notion of who you're dealing with, that's who you're going to see. And you're not going to see anything else, right? So kind of one of the very fucked up things that when I was doing research on boarding schools and private schools, there were certain individuals who would use this sort of tactic where they would create this persona amongst students, staff, and parents, where you would think they were a great person, but they would pick and choose their targets And when that individual or the victim would then come out and be like, hey, I need help because X, Y, and Z, the people that he would come out to wouldn't believe him because they already had a preconceived notion of who that person is. And once that's kind of set in stone, you really can't, breaking those two apart are very difficult. So Keith Renee, very interesting individual. So back to typecasting and pattern recognition. There's been a lot of pattern recognition and typecasting that's been done through, let's put TV shows and movies. There are certain looks through this. I'm just going to put this right here. Physical appearance. Either way. Physical appearance. TV shows, movies, physical appearance. We can also put music videos. News. You know, when the news broadcasts the faces of individuals or the faces of individuals, what people look like. This goes on, but there is a certain physical appearance that we attach to certain descriptors. Criminals, nice people, I guess. We can, right? Some people would like to assume that certain nice people would look a certain way, act a certain way. The same thing with criminals. So there's a whole lot more we could add to this, but essentially, what is it? Descriptors? There's another word for it, right? Like we attach certain physical attributes, the way people dress, the way they look. We attach these certain ideas and we put them into pattern recognition, cognitive abilities, where we will then attach these descriptors to these physical appearances so we can pattern recognize what certain people, who people are, what they act like, what's their MO, their modus operandi. And we get to typecast them. That's why certain actors are forced into roles where, right, this happens heavily here in Hollywood, where you have actors who are forced into roles. They're forced into certain positions because of the way that they look, because of their physical appearances. It's kind of why you'll never really see a superhero that's completely tatted up from head to toe, or you won't see superheroes that don't have who don't have a perfect jawline, who don't have perfect teeth, right? There's certain physical attributes that we force into these roles, and what people don't kind of recognize is when you have this forced role dynamic in movies, television shows, music videos, subconsciously, it affects the whole of the way people view people. This is something that I've thought of myself. I'm pretty sure there are other conspiracy theory minded people that have also come back to this idea or this concept, but I've been thinking about this since I was in middle school, because I always recognized during the time in middle school, I had gone from living in Los Angeles to living in Mexico. And I recognized that there is a very different way of life over there. People are much nicer. It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter. They're just very different. I can't really describe anything else besides that. And not only are they very different, but the way that they handle themselves and the way that they're cordial to one another had nothing to do with these preconceived notions that I had. So, A great example of this would be when I was in elementary school, I would get picked at and I would be made fun of because I would look Asian. So people would call me Chinese, or they would, it was mainly Chinese, right? Ching chong nip nip. Or they would call me Confucius and they would try to rub my belly. But when I lived in Mexico, that didn't exist because there were other kids that also had chinky looking eyes and who looked Asian. But in Mexico, that notion didn't exist because in Mexico, people know what indigenous natives look like. So it wasn't something out of pocket. It was something that was recognizable to people. Instead, I was made fun of for being American. One of my favorite insults that I still remember to this day was being called a bolillo. A bolillo is like a bread that's brown on the outside, but it's white on the inside, right? Because white bread. Very fucked up insult. But the insults changed. So I started having to reevaluate the way I was viewing myself, because in America, I wasn't accepted for X, Y, or Z reasons, but while I was in Mexico, I wasn't accepted for a variety of other reasons. So either way, this goes back into the fact that we have pattern recognition. The human brain just has a way of recognizing certain patterns and playing out those patterns because that's what makes sense to the brain. So, typecasting creates pattern recognition, creates this false dynamic of actors in our lives, and we create these forced roles that we start applying people in. And once we create these preconceived notions of certain people, it's kind of impossible to break them out of them. And a lot of this has to do with physical appearance, with what we dictate to be criminals or nice people, etc., etc. Right? That's why one of my favorite ones from 2016 was Hillary Clinton. She's just like my grandma. Because I would laugh because I remember my grandmothers and they do not remind me anything of her. But back to this. So industry, status quo, contractors, and back to this conspiracy theory of a feedback prison loop, which was essentially through music, movies, and television shows, through the 90s, through gangster rap, through the idolization of, actually, that's a good thing to put right here, idolization of a particular lifestyle, drug dealing, gold chains, we'll just put that right there, right? Because that goes into lifestyle. Physical appearance would be apparel, vocabulary, or what I want to say, speaking, right? Because that changes. I still remember when I moved to Texas and people were very readily like when I lived in Texas, right? So right after living in Mexico, I moved to Texas. Once I lived in Texas, people were very quick to catch on that I was from California. And beyond that, when I left Texas and I moved back to California, people were even quicker to catch on to, you're a Texan, aren't you? And a lot of it had to do with the fact that I didn't just have the dialect of a white American Texan. I also had the dialect of African American Texan, because there were words that I was using that they were kind of like, what did you just say? What does that mean? Why did you say it like that? And it came from the fact that I was hanging out with two very different groups of people. And this goes into a very interesting study with the way talking works. I can't remember where I read this study or where I even watched it, but it was a study where they had a bunch of scientists that were from different parts of the world. And what inevitably happened towards the end of them working together was they all adopted words that they all liked from one another, but they adopted the way of speaking that sounded like the most physically attractive. Essentially, they just adopted the speaking pattern of just one person, but they adopted words and colloquialisms from all the other people that they just kind of liked hearing, or whatever it was. Either way, idolization. So, yeah, the feedback loop for prison. Gold chains and apparel are the same thing. So I don't know why I said that. Vocab, way of speaking, lifestyle, drug dealing. These two are kind of the same. Once you get this idolization, once you get to that thing that everybody wants to be, you essentially create, what do I call, a need. Oops. A need or a desire. Humanity as a whole is fueled by desire. You're fueled by what you want, right? We have other basic needs, but when your basic needs are met, right? Food, water, shelter. Once those three things are fulfilled, and once you have access to those things and you're not really put in a bottleneck of like having to starve for those three basic things, you're basically governed by your desire. As long as you have your basic needs met. That's a whole other point. And with idolization comes desire, and with desire, where does this desire come from? Well, it comes from all of these things. It comes from what you're watching. It comes from look, see, and do. And these three things all come from one place. Your environment. Yep. Your environment. And by environment, I mean friends, TV shows, commercials. Oops. Commercials, right? Because as a kid, you're like, I want that toy, or I want that thing, or I want that thing. So commercials, look, see, do. And to summarize all these things, it's basically what eventually looks cool to you. And what looks cool translates differently to both men and women. Very different. These are very two different realms of thought process at this point. But it all comes from idolization. It comes from some basic point of humanity of you either respect something or you don't respect it. And even then, people aren't necessarily aware of that dynamic, because sometimes people will hate something but will mimic it and won't necessarily recognize from the get-go that they're doing that. So either way, back to idolization, where I came from at it was creating this feedback loop in prison, which comes from the conspiracy theory that there was this effort through these variety of different branches of entertainment, not just entertainment, but the prison system, with policymakers, with I wanted to say Democrats from the beginning, but the Senate, House of Representatives, essentially, they wanted a revolving door. Because when you look at prisons as a whole, it's actually a good place to go with this. When you look at prisons, the whole basic concept of a prison is reform. Reforming your character. Well, I don't know if anybody's ever done this, but if you look at studies that try to give validation or credibility to the fact that these reforming tactics work, none of them work. In reality, prisons don't reform people. They harden them. They harden them. And by harden, it's like when you take steel, heat it up, bang on it, and cool it. And you repeat that process, you harden the material. It doesn't soften. It doesn't change their character. It just makes them more of what that was. And a lot of that has to do with it's kind of a weird way of saying this. Prison has bad people. I'm kind of laughing at myself for saying that. But bad people hanging out with even badder people. What do you think happens? Well, they kind of teach each other. Teach one another. And you have one bad person hanging out with the badder person, and the badder person's like, hey, you seem like you can get up to speed with what I'm about to teach you. Well, they'll teach one another how to do even worse stuff. And that's just one aspect of things, right? That's just one aspect of things. In reality, we don't even get to the fact that there's a term called, which I hate to say this. Oops. Where am I looking at this from? We got prison babies. We have people who can't live. Like once you're inside for so long and you try to go back to normal life, you can't go back to normal life. Like that doesn't exist for you. Like there's I can't remember where I watched this, but it was just something that showed what the statistics were to how many people were in that demographic, where the moment that they get out, they just commit some petty crime to get back in, because they couldn't fathom what life would be like living a 9 to 5, or a lot of it had to do with the fact that how much time that they were inside for, that they couldn't imagine seeing themselves living a normal life after doing what they've done, after seeing what they've done, and after experiencing the life that they had. Anything outside of the normality that they created for themselves was too much to handle, that they just go back. Really fucked up system. Either way. So you have this feedback loop system with prisons that essentially are created by typecasting oneself, right? Because people will assume identities themselves. People will assume identities for others. People will create this illusion for themselves where this is what I am, this is what I'll be forevermore. Then you have the idolization that comes from that sort of thing, especially when you have the lifestyle, especially when you have not the job, but like the apparel, the vocabulary for things, and you are essentially striving for a certain kind of life, right? Then you have the whole aspect of what they're intended for doesn't even do that. They don't even reform people. They don't even actually fix any of the problems. And not to demean, there are a lot of people who actually go to prison, get their GEDs, will then go to like universities, but those are the outliers. When you look at statistics and when you look at the grander scheme of things, a lot of that is more the person. Those are just individual outliers. Those are exceptions, not the rules. So, either way. Right, and this is all coming from music, movies, and television shows, and what people desire and what people idolize. So this is just one aspect of human life that comes from environment. Now, I guess a great way of also putting this is with Latino culture, with cartelisms, drug running. If you look at what music, because I still remember a time where I was listening to a lot of Latino music, and it wasn't always about a corrido. It wasn't always about some like cartel story. But I look at all of the new music coming out now, and that's kind of all there is. If you look at the crime rate, if you look at what people right now currently are idolizing in Mexico, it's all that, just being a criminal. And to add this into my own life, like, I had one of my nephews, is it my nephew? Because it's a cousin's son. Either way, one of my nephews got his 2 younger cousins to dress up, get a gun, and to go rob a place. And like, these kids are under the age of 12. Like, they weren't even 10 years old, and they were already thinking of doing this. because they were like, oh, but that's what the song says. I was just following what the song was saying. And like that was his literal excuse. And I'm just sitting there like, what the fuck is going on? Like, I don't know. That's besides the point. I'm just anecdotal, you know? But this is a problem that exasperates itself because of the environment that you're in, because of the things that you're seeing, the things that you're hearing, the things that you see others doing. Either way. Right? And this is just an aspect of environment. Right? Because you can also replicate. This is just an American system thing. Right? This whole thing with the prison and like industry and all this other shit. This is just America. This is just within the United States. Each country, each local, right? Because each country has its own subset of problems. And they won't necessarily replicate themselves everywhere else. Because the environment has a lot more to do. I don't know how to say this. Right? Like you won't see this entire like prison system work in Japan. Because that's not how it works in Japan. In Japan, you have a different problem. Their environment. All right, we could actually go there. Let's go with an example with Japan and their current environment. Their environment is more, we're going to go with TV shows, which we all, as Americans, we know that as anime. They have the music industry. For them, it's more idols, right? And they have schooling. Schooling is a very big thing in Japan. Here we call prospects. Prospects. Oh, that's actually a very shit color. Prospects. Let me find a good color for this. Okay. Now, prospects. Prospects is essentially, in Japan, that's a very different thing. Because you have to go to a prestigious school in order to get to another prestigious school. You have to work yourself to the bone, right? Like, you're prospecting, you're planting seeds early in your life in order to prosper later down in life. Very different. And you have, in your environment, you have social pressures. Social pressures play a lot in their life. How do I know this? Look, it's not like I've been to Japan. It's not like I've lived in Japan. But I've spoken to enough people who know about their environment that I can kind of gather these things and put them together because they have a huge fucking problem. They have a huge problem. And that's called the incel community. Incels, hikomoris, or declining birth rate. Declining birth rate. Either way. This all kind of plays into one thing because either way, hold on, let me just further elaborate into this. From TV shows and anime to music and the idol industry, which also comes with social pressures, you being prospected, and your schooling. You have pressure. Like, these people live under so much pressure that you don't understand. Like, so they go to school Monday through Saturday. From Monday through Saturday. Then you have cram school. So 70% of the nation, while you're in schooling, you go to school and then you go to cram school. So you got school and more school at the end of that. Then you got to go home and then you got to study. And then the social pressure of it comes with the fact that, right, from schooling and social pressure and your prospects, you have your national exams. So you're constantly being compared to everyone else. And in your national exams, you have, right, like if you don't make it into certain aspects of your like national exam, right, because the schools that you go to emphasize a lot. And they kind of take a lot of pride in making sure that you're a part of this very happy-go-lucky society, and that everybody's getting along, right? And that kind of plays into the fact that they really try to foster a sense of community, like heavily. That's why they don't have janitors in their schools. They typically have the students do the cleaning, and a lot of this is because the nurture side of things is they're trying to nurture a very clean society, which kind of explains why you have certain demographics in Japan that go the extreme opposite way, where they're incredibly dirty. They don't clean their rooms and they're incredibly messy. Right? You try to push people one way, they'll just push back the whole other way. But whatever, those are more outliers, etc., etc. Now, with anime and idols, this kind of goes into the incel community, hikomoris, declining birth rate. It also goes into this very weird side of stalking culture. But like, I'm just describing that you could just take these ideas of environment and the nurture side of things, and you can develop these web of ideas and kind of point out the problems of society, but you have to do it through the lens of what their environment looks like. What are the things that are affecting these groups of people? Now, I don't really know where I wanted to go with the Japan angle, but I'm just kind of elaborating that you could just, this is just a self-replicating thing that as long as you have insight in what community you're trying to talk about, you can draw conclusions of how these problems are, how they arise. So either way, kind of want to erase all this now, because it doesn't matter or pertain to what I'm trying to talk about with people. Now, with the whole thing of people, right? And this is just the environment aspect of things. I did not even go into how your environment, can we go back to yellow, please? Yes, I like yellow. How your environment also has the media. And by media, I'm talking about the news. But it's a whole other bag of worms that we're not going to even touch yet. Let's go back to genetics. Boy, genetics. There's so much in this. So much of this. So, right, even in that video that I showed, you had people like Socrates. Well, you also had the medieval ages, where they were always trying to breed the best of the best within the upper echelons of nobility, etc., etc. Were you from good stock or bad stock? Then, from a more modern aspect side of things, you have the eugenics office, the eugenics record office, the ERO. I've talked about this in one of my previous videos. You had people like Laughlin. You had, I'm trying to think of a more modern type of thing, because we could just go with CRISPR. I don't even remember how to spell it. Either way, you had this whole idea that at the turn of the century, the 21st century, you had a lot of research that went into figuring out the limits of humanity. I have this really great meme where it's just basically, there's two sides of a face, right? One of them is all happy and trying to look nice, and it says, the CIA in movies, we have to save America. And the other side of the face is it more demonic looking and scarier looking. But the CIA in reality is, how much LSD can we give somebody before they lose their mind, right? There's this very different dynamic of what we like to see the CIA has and what the CIA has really done. No, it actually gets much worse if you know what I know. It gets very dark very quickly. Like it was never sunshine and rainbows, like ever, like ever, like ever, like even the creation of America, like ever, like not once was any of this for anyone's benefit, like ever. Either way, 21st century, you had research, limits of humanity. What else did we get in the 21st century? Oh, we have trust fund babies. Oh, God. Not the trust fund babies. Now, when you have all three of these things, right? By research, we're just going to put... what's another word for research? We'll just put scientist. Scientists are just crazy people. Doesn't matter. Now, when you combine all three of these things, when you want to test the limits of humanity, you got a bunch of scientists that can do the research for you, and you have a bunch of people that could just kind of fund the whole thing. Oh, and trust me, the trust funds babies, they have the politicians on their side. They could just buy out anybody in Congress. And it's been that way since quite a while. And the trust fund babies also have schools. And by schools, I'm talking universities. Oh, trust. This is a very deeply rooted problem. When you have all three of these things, what do you think they all want in common? Well, they want... They want... an efficient workforce. They want workers who are efficient, who are going to do their job, and are not going to complain. And kind of this is where, at least back during the genetic days, right, before they figured out that this wasn't necessarily a part of genetics, it was more a part of the nurture side of things. This was a very long time ago, right? Like at tail end of the 1800s, all they could see was efficient workforce. Well, let's see if we could figure this out with our favorite science, eugenics. Eugenics. And that's where you got the ERO office. That's when you had people appointed like the ERO office in creating an efficient workforce. They also had the Jamaican Studies. You also had IBM. They were a solutions company at this time. Trust, this fits in much later, not right now. But just at the turn of the century, Jamaican Studies just kind of relates to EBM. Not necessarily... We'll get there later. Either way. And a lot of what fueled this idea of having an efficient workforce were early union riots. Because we have to remember that there were a few depressions that occurred at early American history. And what kind of fueled it was... funnily enough, the Irish. That's kind of why the Irish were hated for quite some time. And this goes into a whole lot of other issues where you had people who were very vindictive against the Irish. And like they really made an effort into getting rid of them. That's a conversation for another time. Well, in creating an efficient workforce, they just decided to use eugenics as a form of... we need to create the best horse, the best workhorse is kind of the language that they were using, because they had assumed that, well, this goes into this video.
So evolution of evolution is not just policy, it's also technology. What I mean by that is we got the random brothers over here. They figured out how to make casinos. Then Mendel comes along by a random twist of fate. His works get picked up and worked on. And he figures out how to predict the breeding outcomes of plants and animals, leads to science's wackiest human being ever, coming around with breeding of humans, which then Watson and Crick, where they figured out DNA. Right? So here's where we go from policy to technology. We're increasing the resolution of our prediction power. And we get to the father of the Human Genome Project, where they mapped human DNA. And now we're finally here, the inventor of CRISPR, where we can modify the DNA of living beings on the fly. This is critical because while CRISPR itself, there are problems. There are a million problems with CRISPR. It's probably not even going to be the answer. But
yeah, they still have a lot of problems with trying to like modify DNA and it being a workable thing. But there's been a lot of science that has kind of worked towards this. And people are going to say that I'm jumping hoops and they're like, you're reaching conclusions that don't necessarily make sense. And I'm like, follow the money, follow the paperwork. There's always been this idea that through some form of control, they wish to steer things in a certain kind of favor. Now, during the time that I'm talking about, remember, this is like 1890s to 1920s. Now, this has a whole lot to do with religion, moving people away from the faith. This also has a lot more to do with birth control, sex, rock and roll, trust. This seems convoluted, but when you look at the people who were involved and you look at where a lot of the money came from, the money always came from the same people. It was never anybody complicated. It was always from the same place. And eventually, from the 1890s to the 1920s, you get into everybody's favorite word, MK Ultra. The MK Ultra experiments. Now, right, all of this stuff, eugenics, workforce, all of this was funded by at least one group that was familiar, and that's what I call, or this is literally what it's called. It's called the Macy Foundation. Well, Macy's as in the store, but the foundation name is actually called Josiah. The Josiah Macy's Foundation. This is just the name of the dad who created the trust fund for his daughter, who later married into the Churchill family, who married the guy who created Marlboro cigarettes. But that's a whole other bag of worms that we could talk about. So genetics has always been this thing that's been of interest. But all of this stuff, from genetics to environment to this very complicated loop system of figuring out people, eventually all of this got boiled down to something much, much simpler. And before I get there, I want to fix my background. Oops. I'm erasing. I want to color it in so my yellow looks much nicer on the screen. Either way. So, right around the 1930s. Right around the 1930s is where we get one of the best forms. Okay, I say this, but this science is fucking evil. Dastardly evil. We get to cybernetics. Cybernetics. Now, don't be confused with the word cyber in it. Cybernetics, I could probably type it in right now, just so we could get the Google definition. What is the nice version of this? The science of communications and automatic control systems in both machines and living things. I wonder if we could get my favorite image. Here it is. Click on this. Visiting an interesting website. Can I continue? Fail to establish. Okay. Apparently I'm not allowed. Okay, can't visit this website either. Very interesting. I have this picture saved somewhere. Either way. I'm kind of get annoyed that I can't view this picture. Can I get it here? No, can't visit that website either. Very interesting that I can't visit this. Is my microphone on? Yes, my microphone is on. Can I do a Google image search? Is that another university? Cybernetics and Capitalism. It's a podcast. Very interesting. Either I just want the picture. Just give me the picture. Step 1. Cybernetics, machines, feedback, and cascades. One-dimensional capitalism. Subjecting justice to capital. Deterioration. Positive and negative energy. Decoding and regulation valves. Either way. Actually, I think this website in Spanish, like, there's a reason why I'm trying to get this picture, right? Bear with me a little bit. Oh, this machine. Ooh. Either way. Here we go. Now, cybernetics was essentially, let's go back to all, the science of communications and automatic control systems in both machines and living things. So if we type in cybernetics and the Macy conferences, Macy conference, let's click on this really quick. They had a few conferences. Not really. They had 10 conferences, and it spanned a little less than 10 years. But there was an agenda to what the topics were each and every single year. Stimulated neural networks, emulating the calculus of propositional logic, anthropology, scientific study of humanity, concerned with human behavior, human biology, culture, societies, and linguistics, and how computers might learn how to learn. Object perception feedback mechanism, essentially how the optical eye worked and how what you saw was essentially kind of being perceived. Perceptual differences due to brain damage. Deriving ethics from science. Compulsive repetitive behavior. One of my favorite ones, in 1947, child psychology. They had one Macy conference completely dedicated to child psychology. Eventually, I want to say around 1949, they started creating pamphlets for people to take home, and it was kind of like an overview of what was learned during each foundation. So a lot of these beginning ones don't have any of these pamphlets. So it's kind of up in the air what was learned. But overview. The Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation developed two innovations specifically designed to encourage and facilitate interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary exchanges. When they invited all of these people together, from Turning, McCullough, Mead, Weiner, Shannon, these were the best scientists in their respective fields. From biology to math to telecommunications, they invited the best minds together, but they ran into a problem. They couldn't talk to one another because in their field of science, what one word meant to one person meant a completely different word to another person. So eventually they had to figure out, how do we communicate with one another, and how do we use our best expertise of one another, but how do we communicate with one another, right? A lot of it just had to come down to, what does this word mean for you, and what does this word mean for you? Either way. Macy conferences were essentially conversations held in a conference setting with participants presenting research while it was still in process, rather than after it had been completed. These were more formal than conversations. Papers were prepared ahead of time and circulated, but less formal than conferences. Macy's transactions were transcribed, rightly circulated to those who could not attend. Right, so there was an intelligence report that were written up and handed out to certain people. These were far more informal than typical proceedings, which published revised versions of the conference papers served to invite additional scholars into the exchange. The explicit goal was to let a wider audience hear the experts exchange ideas and think out loud about their own work. Right, and said topics were very interesting. I tend to believe these conferences, at least some of the material that they were talking about, or some of the ideas that they were speaking on, kind of led and were used in a lot of MK Ultra studies. Because, how do I say this? Behavioral psychology, cognitive psychology, information theory, human machine, brain, plasticity, neoliberalism, flexibility, governmental ability, neural governance, right? Human, animal, and machine. Essentially, the idea and the concept of how the human mind processes information, they wanted to know how they could replicate that thought pattern, or how the human mind perceived information, and how they could translate that not just to machine, but to see how they could input information if it was either human, animal, or machine, and if they could replicate that. And kind of why I thought it was very interesting that this machine was here. Desmoció sus propias y profundamente famosa tangluas robóticas. This is in Spanish, but we get into an individual called, I think his name was Dr. Jose Delgado. He had a famous bull experiment. Yeah, here we go. Jose Delgado and mind control.
Mind control research is not new. A scientific milestone in this area came in the 1960s when Dr. Jose Delgado demonstrated remote control over a charging bull. By connecting a radio antenna to electrodes inserted into the bull's brain, Delgado proved that the animal's aggressive impulses could be thwarted by electronically manipulating the bull's muscle reflexes.
Do you realize the fantastic possibilities if from the outside we could modify the inside? Could we give messages to the inside? But the beauty is that now we are not using electrodes.
In recent years, Delgado has shown that the behavior of monkeys can be altered using low-power, pulsating magnetic fields.
Either way, it's just an example of things. Again, this just goes back into the fact that there has been this effort into understanding the human mind. So I'm not saying the cybernetics is the be and end all. If you listen to a lot of the people that were involved in cybernetics, they essentially called it the science of systems. I know that I read the definition off of Google, but I kind of typically tend to lean more towards the people that were involved, or people that had firsthand involvement in a lot of these places. I still think I have a tab open of somebody on this. Discovering. Pretty sure I have it somewhere. Either way, the science of systems. Not just cybernetics, but we also had Jose Delgado. And what he was doing, either way, I don't even want to get there. Cybernetics, I wanted to get to the fact that this was funded by the Macy Foundation. I like calling it the Macy's Foundation because it's more identifiable with the average American viewer because, you know, at one point in time you've been to a mall. So we get to the Josiah Junior Macy Foundation. They completely funded this whole thing. If you also follow the money with them, we're also kind of involved with the MK Ultra studies. And this is provable by documents that are within the Congress of America. Like, I remember just Googling stuff randomly, and it took me to the George Washington University of DC, and it was essentially like a pamphlet that was basically saying it had a long list of donors and a long list of people that were essentially just giving money towards certain programs and certain research material that was going on in certain universities. Either way. And they also kind of funded a lot of the things that happened in the, what was it called? Plutonium Files. Plutonium Files. This is a very great book. Plutonium Files were essentially a book composed by this lady who was doing research on human experiments that were going on. And it was through her research, I want to say at the tail end of the 80s, where she essentially uncovered a lot more information that kind of went back into MK Ultra. But there was a very nice president who kind of got ahead of the curve and was like, oh, don't worry, we'll handle all of this research material. And once he got to it, he essentially destroyed all of the research material, and nothing was ever really put out in the forefront to explain what kind of research material was going on in relation to not just MK Ultra, but in general to human studies that were occurred without people even knowing. So, either way. With cybernetics, you essentially had, I don't even know, how long am I already? An hour and 22. I'm actually going to leave it here. Because if I talk about cybernetics, I can go on for another hour because there's no real place for me to start in, because I would essentially have to kind of describe something like this, where I used the feedback loop that's created in prisons, and how the culture itself feeds the notion and popularizes certain aspects of a culture, creating idolization, creating this desire and need to mimic certain behavior, which will, if you mimic this behavior, will lead you to having problems with the police or government officials or this way of living a normal life. And with you contradicting the laws, policies, you'll be put into prison. And once you're in prison, there are certain active activities that could go on in there. And if you begin to have pattern recognizing abilities in prison, because you're forced into a different lifestyle, and in order for you to survive in this new environment, you have to take up these new roles. And if you take up these new roles and you stay there actively for far longer than you thought you were going to have to, it becomes a part of your life. And once you hardened yourself, and once you've adopted this new lifestyle to such a degree, leaving and or living outside of that paradigm becomes incredibly difficult. So I'm essentially not just describing, I'm just describing a system. right? A science of systems. I'm just essentially describing the prison system in terms of what creates it, how do you get involved in it, what are the elements and factors that will put you into it. Because there's another kind of system, be education or university or higher learning, whatever you want to call it. That's just another system that exists in our reality. How do we validate information? Or how do we know the authenticity of certain information? Well, here you would get into the news, media system, where this is what essentially describes truth. What's real, what's not real, etc., whatever. The system of science is essentially describing the system or the feedback loop system. Like, does this system, if the system feeds into itself, it's a feedback loop system. If this system always ends up in an independent, right? The way things should naturally work is they lead somewhere. It ends somewhere. But if this system keeps feeding into itself, this is what you call a feedback loop system, where it'll perpetually keep itself alive because you've created, there's that meme that essentially says that you can't create an electric generator that keeps producing electricity. Well, through the means of cybernetics, the system of science, and through the means of using psychology and certain aspects of the human mind, they've essentially created certain systems that will perpetually keep feeding itself over and over and over again. And in order to break out of that cycle, it requires, knowing the truth in a lot of things. But either way, people are a very hard thing to describe. That's why I wanted to go with the anime review, but at the same time, I can't have it just be a review of an anime that nobody's going to watch. But I'm going to do my best to make the idea and the concept introducible enough. Now, I'm going to do the interview through using cybernetics as explaining the system and how it feeds into itself. Because the plot twist in that anime kind of really hinges on describing how this system was initially built. But either way, my name is Ramirez, and I think I've gone for far too long.